Um, so you know how we are all pretty much raised with this underlying assumption that you are either highly intelligent or, well, you're just not.
Oh, yeah. It is an incredibly comforting illusion, just putting human capacity into a neat little box.
Right, like I always picture a standardized test. You have a ticking clock, those weird spatial reasoning puzzles, and at the end of it all, you get a clean binary number.
And that number is supposedly the definitive ceiling on your potential, which makes hiring easy, it makes grading easy.
But it completely fails to capture how the human brain actually interacts with the real world.
Exactly.
And so, for today's deep dive, our mission is to explore a framework that completely shatters that neat little box. We're looking at a fascinating source today.
Yeah, it's a profound one.
It is Chapter 5 of Philosophical Essays by the philosopher Abdul Jabbar Al-Waily. The chapter is titled Intelligence Between Reality and Imagination, or in Arabic, Sakin.
Yeah. And as we unpack this, you might recognize yourself or maybe your colleagues in these descriptions. Because Al-Waily isn't just classifying personality types.
No, yeah.
He is diagnosing the actual cognitive machinery that dictates, who builds our cities, who writes our laws, and who ends up completely alienated by modern society.
Yeah, and his core argument is that intelligence isn't a single number at all. Instead, it is this brutal, lifelong tug of war between two contrasting poles.
Two total extremes.
Right. On one end, you have absolute reality, and on the other end, pure imagination.
So let's start with that first pole.
Okay, yeah. He introduces the first category as realistic or practical intelligence. And the analogy he uses in the text is just striking. He describes this type of mind as essentially being a tape recorder.
A tape recorder, which is honestly a really powerful mechanical metaphor.
It really is.
Because this is an individual who is utterly, completely immersed in their immediate physical environment. I mean, the sensory processing is turned up to maximum for objective data.
Right, they just absorb the news, the physical dimensions of a room, the exact phrasing of a conversation they had 3 days ago.
Yeah, and they can play it back with perfect fidelity.
I instantly picture that one person in the office who just inherently knows how the entire machine operates. Like they know the exact inventory, the unwritten social hierarchies.
The verbatim recap of yesterday's staff meeting.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And Al-Waily actually calls this the intelligence of familiar coexistence.
The intelligence of familiar coexistence. I like that.
It is like an operating system that processes the immediate code flawlessly, right? It runs the hardware right in front of it without a single glitch.
That is a really great way to look at it, because the mechanism driving this practical mind is a reliance on continuous, tangible feedback loops.
They need objective input to generate an output.
Right. And because of this, they are the absolute backbone of a functioning society. I mean, they thrive in commerce, navigating market prices and supply chains.
Yeah.
They thrive in the military, managing really complex logistical realities.
But there is a cognitive trade-off, isn't there?
A massive one. If you ask this highly tuned operating system to run a program that relies on the unseen, like abstract philosophy, theoretical physics, or, I don't know, avant-garde art, the system basically crashes.
Because they just don't have the data points.
Exactly. They lack the cognitive mechanism to generate subjective reality. They can only manipulate what already exists right in front of them.
Which sets up the complete opposite pole perfectly, the imaginative intelligence.
The other end of the spectrum.
Right. So if the practical mind is the flawless operating system running the current hardware, the imaginative mind is the developer staring at a blank screen.
Trying to write an entirely new operating system from scratch.
One that doesn't even exist yet. And according to the text, these individuals are heavily detached from reality.
Oh, severely detached.
They are the absent-minded dreamers who, frankly, might completely fail at running a market stall or, keeping track of daily inventory.
Because they're so consumed by their subjective internal world, often at the direct expense of the objective external world.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because I have to push back on Al-Waily's framing here.
Go for it.
If this highly imaginative mind is so utterly detached that they actively fail at basic daily practical tasks, why on earth does the author consider them highly intelligent at all?
That's a fair question.
I mean, in a modern corporate setting, this person isn't called a genius. They are put on a performance improvement plan for missing deadlines,
Yeah, you are hitting on the exact friction point that makes his whole theory so vital. Our modern corporate settings reward the management of the status quo.
Right.
But Al-Waily is defining a different architecture of thought entirely. He calls it the intelligence of innovation.
The intelligence of innovation.
Okay, the practical mind manages the current reality, but the imaginative mind generates new reality.
Oh, wow.
They aren't tethered to existing feedback loops, and that lack of a tether allows them to conceptualize solutions, technologies, and art that break the current rules of the universe. They bring the unfamiliar into the world.
But the author does include a pretty terrifying warning about pushing either of these poles to their absolute 100% limits, right?
He does. The extreme outer edges of this spectrum are where the human mind breaks down entirely.
Yeah.
Al-Waily argues that an absolute 100% immersion in reality with zero imagination reduces a human to an animalistic state.
Because you lose the ability to project into the future.
Exactly.
You're only reacting to the immediate stimuli right in front of you. He uses the word fodder, like an animal just reacting to a food source.
There is zero conceptualization of tomorrow.
And on the flip side, what about absolute immersion in imagination?
Well, according to him, that is the clinical definition of madness.
The anchor rope to the physical world just snaps.
Yeah, when the internal mechanism that generates subjective thought completely overrides the sensory input of the external world, you can no longer differentiate between illusion and objective fact.
And that is insanity.
Precisely. So for the great innovators to actually function in society, they require at least a razor-thin thread connecting them back to reality.
But okay, if you have a society full of these visionary innovators who only have a razor-thin thread to reality people who can invent the future but, can't even remember to clock in on time, it really exposes a massive blind spot in how we assign value to people.
Oh, we misjudge them constantly. And this is actually one of Al-Waily's sharpest critiques of modern society.
How we measure intelligence.
Yes, our methods for measuring intelligence are fundamentally rigged to favor the tape recorder.
He critiques a concept called the shop window test, which I found fascinating.
Oh, the shop window test is such a great example.
Historically, some people tried to measure intelligence by having a person stand in front of a shop window full of random goods for, half a minute. And then they would turn the person around and ask them to recite every single item they saw.
Right, and whoever remembers the most items gets the highest intelligence score.
Which is essentially every standardized test I ever took in high school.
Oh, absolutely.
It is the modern corporate quarterly review, Here are your metrics, here's the syllabus, memorize it, and recite it back to me on a Tuesday morning.
We are measuring the storage capacity of a hard drive and pretending we are measuring processing power.
Exactly. And by using the shop window test, you completely filter out the imaginative minds.
You miss them entirely.
And to prove how absurd this is, the author shares a brilliant historical anecdote about Albert Einstein.
Yes, the bus fare story. This is so memorable. So Einstein, who is arguably the greatest inventive mind of the 20th century, is riding a bus.
Yeah.
He hands the conductor a dime, a 10-cent coin for a 10-cent fare. But then he just stands there waiting for change.
Wait, really? He just stood there?
Yes. He completely misjudged the physical, objective reality of the metal in his own hand. He thought he had handed over a larger coin.
And the bus conductor, who presumably lives entirely in the practical world of familiar coexistence, just assumes Einstein is cognitively delayed.
The conductor assumes incompetence because he is applying the shop window test to a man who is actively rewriting the laws of physics in his head.
Wow.
What is fascinating here is that Einstein wasn't lacking cognitive bandwidth. His bandwidth was just fully allocated to his imagination.
Right. If his brain was highly attentive to the mundane reality of his morning commute, he wouldn't have had the immense detached focus required to conceptualize relativity. That makes perfect sense. And Al-Waily points out this isn't limited to theoretical science either. It applies to the arts as well.
Oh yeah, he uses a great art example.
He brings up Michelangelo, who famously claimed he didn't actually sculpt with his hands but with his brain.
Yeah, he visualized it.
Right. He said his imagination was so powerful that he would visualize the finished statue standing perfectly inside the raw marble block. His hands were simply chipping away the excess physical reality to reveal the subjective imagination underneath.
That is just a perfect demonstration of the imaginative mind imposing its internal will onto the external world.
I have to play devil's advocate here, though, for a second.
Okay, do it.
Isn't Michelangelo just experiencing like an eccentric artistic process.
Hmm.
Does visualizing a statue really count as a fundamentally different architecture of intelligence compared to someone who just logically plans out where to hit the chisel?
It absolutely does, because it completely bypasses the step-by-step logical constraints of the practical mind.
Okay, how so?
The practical mind requires a blueprint, a physical guide to tell them what to do next. Michelangelo didn't need external instructions. His internal visualization was so robust that it functioned as a substitute for objective reality.
Oh, I see.
That is a radically different cognitive mechanism than rote memorization. You simply cannot measure that with a multiple choice test.
Okay, so if the practical mind is stuck managing the present and the imaginative mind is lost generating the future, logic kind of dictates that you would need a hybrid to survive the day-to-day while still moving forward.
You definitely do.
So does Al-Waily address the rest of us? The people who aren't exactly Einstein, but aren't just unthinking tape recorders either.
He does, and it's actually where the vast majority of humanity resides. He calls it the middle category.
The middle ground.
Yeah, these individuals possess a fluctuating, dynamic mix of both reality and imagination.
Okay.
They have the sensory awareness to function in the daily grind, mixed with just enough conceptualization to let their minds wander.
And the specific mechanism he describes for how this middle group innovates is fascinating.
Yeah.
Because they don't typically have these spontaneous divine bolts of inspiration like Michelangelo, right?
No, not usually.
They advance society through what Al-Waily calls lucky accidents.
Lucky accidents. That phrase captures the friction of the middle ground perfectly.
Let's break down the psychology of the lucky accident, because I love this part.
Sure.
A purely imaginative person might experience a lucky accident, say, a chemical spills in a lab, or a tool breaks in a weird way, and they immediately forget it because they're distracted by a new internal thought.
Right, it doesn't register.
And a purely practical person sees the exact same accident, categorizes it as an error because it breaks the familiar rules of the shop window, and just throws it in the trash.
Exactly. But the middle ground mind processes that anomaly differently.
How so?
They have enough imaginative flexibility to say, this breaks the rules, but what if that's actually a good thing?
Right.
Combined with enough practical grit to actually track the error, stabilize it, and turn it into a product that solves a real-world problem, they are the ones who capture the lightning in the bottle.
So because we have these wildly different cognitive profiles, the recorders, the innovators, and the middle ground opportunists, the way we allocate these human resources becomes the single most important task of society.
It really does.
Which brings us to the immense, heavy burden placed on educators.
Oh, education is huge in this framework. Al-Waily is adamant that the primary monumental function of a teacher is not the delivery of facts.
Right. It's not about the shop window.
Exactly. Their highest calling is to act almost like psychological detectives. They must identify the innate cognitive architecture of a student and route them accordingly.
The metaphor he uses here is deeply visceral. He says putting a student in the wrong educational field is like planting a tree in the wrong place.
Planting a tree in the wrong soil. Think about the sheer waste of human potential that implies.
It is tragic. You take a deeply imaginative mind, someone who fails your standardized tests, but can visualize entirely new concepts, and you force them into an accounting degree because it's, quote, safe.
Or you take a highly practical kinesthetic learner who thrives on tangible mechanics, and you force them to write essays on abstract poetry.
Right. The tree might survive, but it is starved of the specific nutrients its cognitive profile requires. It will never bear fruit.
The psychological toll of that misalignment is massive, and Al-Waily insists that practical minds must be fiercely guided toward the applied sciences, tangible trades, mechanics, administration, places where their hyper-awareness is literally a superpower.
And meanwhile, the imaginative minds.
They must be protected and guided toward theoretical sciences, arts, literature, and philosophy.
But placing the right mind in the right soil doesn't just apply to choosing a college major at the micro level, right?
No, it goes much bigger.
It scales all the way up to the macro level, like who manages the entire forest.
Yes, the governance of civilizations.
This is where Al-Waily takes his psychological framework and applies it directly to politics and society.
And we should probably clarify here, as we examine his political philosophy, our goal is to impartially dissect his logic.
Yes, we are not endorsing a specific modern political ideology or taking sides.
Right. We are looking strictly at how his theory of intelligence dictates the survival of a state.
Understood. So he issues a really severe warning about what happens when a civilization hands absolute power to purely practical or specifically purely military minds.
The mechanism behind this failure is exactly what makes them good at their daily jobs.
Right, the tape recorders.
Practical minds thrive on immediate, tangible realities. When they are placed in ultimate leadership, they treat the entire nation like an inventory list or a tactical battlefield. They are entirely reactionary.
To use his exact phrasing, he says they look no further than their noses.
Because they lack the imaginative capacity for abstract modeling, they cannot conceptualize the long-term, unseen consequences of a policy 10 years down the line.
They only see the immediate threat or the immediate gain.
Which Al-Waily argues inevitably drags a civilization into ruin or endless cycles of short-sighted conflict.
Okay, so if the practical mind lacks the vision to steer the ship, the natural assumption is that we should put the imaginative innovators in charge.
You would think so.
But we already established they can't even pay bus fare correctly. So the ideal ruler has to be that hybrid, right?
Yes. Al-Waily introduces the concept of the wise men.
The wise men.
A civilization truly thrives when governed by civilian leaders who have cultivated an incredibly rare, balanced cognitive profile.
What does that balance look like?
They possess practical knowledge, but it is tempered by a deep moral grounding, an ascetic rejection of material greed, and a visionary willingness to sacrifice immediate gains for the long-term, abstract good of the people.
But wait, he doesn't just hand a blank check to civilian leaders, does he?
Oh, absolutely not.
The text contains a brutal takedown of a specific type of civilian ruler that he calls the trickster.
The trickster is perhaps the most dangerous archetype in his entire framework.
How does the trickster differ from the wise man?
Well, a wise man balances reality and imagination to build a better society. The trickster actively weaponizes the space between reality and imagination for their own power.
Oh, that's dark.
Al-Waily describes them as leaders who intentionally fish in muddy waters. They have a manipulative intelligence that constantly mixes objective truth with subjective falsehoods.
So they blur the lines so the populace can no longer tell if they are dealing with reality or illusion.
Exactly. And a populace that cannot agree on objective reality is easily controlled. The trickster doesn't innovate, They disorient.
That is incredibly relevant.
Therefore, Al-Waily concludes that the true benchmark of a great civilization isn't the size of its military or the wealth in its markets.
What is it then?
A civilization is measured by two things: its ability to protect its imaginative innovators who push boundaries, and its ability to elevate genuinely wise leaders who can navigate the space between reality and imagination without exploiting it.
So let's tie all these threads together. Al-Waily has given us a completely different lens through which to view human value.
He really has.
We started by dismantling the IQ score, replacing it with a cognitive tug-of-war between the hyper-practical tape recorders who keep society functioning and the detached, absent-minded innovators who dream up what comes next.
And we saw how our modern standardized testing completely misdiagnoses genius because it relies on that shallow shop window test.
Right. We examined the psychological mechanics of the middle ground, where lucky accidents are translated into progress, and of course the monumental duty of educators to stop planting trees in the wrong soil.
Which is such a powerful takeaway.
And finally, we scaled those cognitive profiles up to the fate of nations, contrasting the short-sighted reactionary leadership of the purely practical with the manipulative disorientation of the tricksters, all in search of the truly wise.
It is a framework that forces you to rethink every interaction you have. And I actually want to leave you with a final thought to ponder that builds on the mechanics we've explored today.
Well, please do.
Al-Waily warned that total immersion in reality is animalistic, and total immersion in imagination is madness. Well, as you go about your day, look at the screens around you, the digital ecosystem you engage with every single day. The algorithms are simultaneously flooding us with endless, hyper-realistic data, 24/7 news, immediate metrics, tangible outrage pushing us toward that reactionary animalistic state.
While at the exact same time driving us into highly curated, algorithmically isolated imaginative bubbles where objective facts no longer matter.
Yes. The technology we use daily is actively amplifying both of Al-Waily's extreme poles of intelligence, pulling the human mind in opposite directions simultaneously.
Wow.
So in an era where the machinery of society constantly pushes us toward digital madness on one side and animalistic reaction on the other, how do we and how do our leaders actively fight to maintain the grounding, visionary balance of the wise?
That is a phenomenal question to walk away with. Because ultimately, human intelligence isn't a clean metric. It is a vast, messy, beautiful spectrum between the ground we stand on and the futures we have the courage to imagine. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We will catch you next time.